Adwoa entered the courtroom with quiet grace, her movements steady and controlled. She was 55 years old, a grandmother whose life had been marked by hardship and endurance. Though she did not wear fine clothes, her simple attire was neat, and her presence carried a dignity that made people look twice. Her face, lined with years of struggle, was calm, and her eyes held wisdom that only experience could give. She came that day only as a witness, nothing more. She had no desire for attention, no wish to be at the center of things. Yet, when she stepped into the courtroom, people noticed her. Some whispered, curious about who she was. Others simply stared, sensing something strong behind her gentle appearance. Few truly understood the quiet strength that rested inside her, the kind of strength that comes from surviving storms without breaking. The room was tense. It was filled with lawyers, officers, and onlookers, each with their own thoughts and motives. The case being heard was one that had stirred emotion in the community. People expected arguments, accusations, and maybe even conflict. Into that space walked Adwoa, calm like the eye of a storm. She made no noise, yet her presence was louder than many voices in the room. She sat on the wooden bench, folding her hands in her lap. Her steps had been slow but not weak. She walked with purpose, even though she carried the years of her life on her shoulders. For her, this was just another moment in a long journey filled with both pain and endurance. For the others, however, her presence felt unusual, almost commanding. When her name was called, she rose. Her movement was deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant. Every eye turned toward her as she walked forward. She did not look down, nor did she look around. Her gaze was steady, fixed ahead, as though she carried within her an unshakable truth. Adwoa stood before the court, not with pride but with quiet courage. She was not there to impress or to please. She was there because she had something to say, and when she opened her mouth, her voice filled the room. It was not loud, but it was strong. Each word was clear, firm, and honest. She spoke without fear, as someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to gain. Her words carried weight because they came from truth. She did not exaggerate, nor did she bend her story to please anyone. She simply told what she had seen and what she knew. The court, which had been restless moments before, grew silent. Even the lawyers who were ready to interrupt found themselves listening. Adwoa's presence began to shift the atmosphere. Those who thought her old and powerless soon realized that she was neither. Her calm strength unsettled some and inspired others. She spoke like a woman who had walked through life's darkest valleys and still stood tall. She had entered the courtroom thinking she was only a witness, one voice among many. But in that moment her voice rose above all others. Without even knowing it, she had begun to change the course of the day. That day the court would not only hear Adwoa's testimony. It would see something greater, the quiet strength of a woman who carried truth in her heart and courage in her soul. And though no one yet knew how events would unfold, it was clear that Adwoa was no ordinary witness. She was the beginning of a story that the courtroom would never forget. ChatGPT said. The courtroom had been buzzing with tension even before the hearing began, but when Officer Kweku stood to speak, the air grew heavier. Kweku was a man people knew well. His sharp voice, quick temper, and heavy hand had earned him both fear and silence wherever he walked. He was not the kind of man who liked to be questioned, and certainly not by someone like Adwoa, a grandmother with no power or position. As Adwoa rose to share her account, her voice was calm and steady. She did not rush. Each word left her lips with care, as if truth itself guided her tongue. She spoke not to please the court but to tell what she had seen. Yet her calmness seemed to irritate Kweku. He shifted in his seat, tapping the table, then stood abruptly, cutting across her words. "Enough," he barked. His voice boomed through the courtroom. "You do not know what you are talking about." Gasps rippled across the benches. Adwoa, however, did not flinch. She turned her gaze toward him, her eyes steady and unshaken. She opened her mouth to continue, but Kweku's impatience boiled over. He stepped closer, his hands slicing the air in anger, and before anyone could react, the sound cracked like lightning. He had slapped her. The room froze. The noise of the slap echoed against the high walls, followed by a silence so sharp it felt like the air itself had been cut. Gasps filled the room, some people covering their mouths, others rising slightly from their seats in disbelief. Even the judge's gavel hovered in midair as if struck speechless. Adwoa's head turned with the force, but she did not stumble. Her hand slowly rose to her cheek, where the sting of his palm burned against her skin. Yet she did not cry. She did not shout. Her lips pressed together, her back remained straight, and her eyes stayed clear. In that silence, her dignity glowed brighter than any words could. She looked at Kweku not with fear but with something deeper, a quiet defiance that spoke louder than anger ever could. She was a woman who had endured storms far greater than a slap. And though her face bore the mark of his temper, her spirit stood untouchable. The people in the courtroom whispered in shock. Some muttered about shame. Others stared at Kweku, their fear of him slowly turning into disapproval. For once, the officer who always commanded the room now seemed small. His anger, his power, his uniform, none of it could hide what he had just done in plain sight. Adwoa lowered her hand and folded it once more in front of her. She said nothing, but her silence roared through the room. The judge's gavel finally struck the desk, calling for order, but even the banging could not drown out the weight of what had happened. In that moment it was no longer just a hearing. It was a reckoning. Adwoa had come as a witness, but now her calm endurance had drawn every eye to her. The slap that was meant to silence her had instead made her the strongest voice in the court. And though no one yet knew it, the course of the day had shifted. The people had seen what Kweku truly was, and they had seen what Adwoa carried within her. A storm had begun, and its center was no longer the officer's rage, it was the quiet, unbroken strength of a grandmother who refused to bow. The courtroom was still tense after the shocking moment. The sound of the slap lingered in everyone's ears, and the silence that followed was heavy. People looked at each other, unsure of what would happen next. Then, unexpectedly, the judge stood, whispered to one of the clerks and stepped out of the room. His sudden exit left the hall unsettled. Whispers grew louder, like restless winds before a storm. Some asked why the judge had left so quickly. Others wondered if he was shaken by what had happened. The gavel lay on the desk, untouched, as if waiting for someone worthy to command it. At first no one moved. Then one of the senior court officials rose, his eyes scanning the room. They had all seen Adwoa's composure, her strength, and her refusal to break under humiliation. She had shown more discipline than even those in authority. Slowly, a bold thought spread among them. If anyone could hold this room together, it was her. "Madam," one of the clerks said softly, bowing his head with respect, "please, take the judge's seat until he returns." The courtroom gasped again. Adwoa, the grandmother who had come only as a witness, was being invited to sit where only the highest authority usually sat. She hesitated, her hands folded in front of her. She had never imagined such a thing. But the eyes of the people were on her, eyes that now carried respect, not pity. With slow, steady steps she began to walk forward. Her sandals tapped gently against the polished floor, the sound echoing in the silence. Every step felt heavier than the last, yet she did not stop. When she reached the desk, she paused, her eyes glancing at the gavel that rested there. Then, with the same calm dignity she had carried all her life, Adwoa lowered herself into the judge's seat. The room seemed to shift. The benches creaked as people leaned forward, watching in awe. Even Officer Kweku, who had slapped her moments earlier, looked unsettled. His eyes darted around the room as if unsure how to respond to this sudden change. Adwoa sat tall, her back straight, her hands resting gently on the desk. She did not raise her voice or try to act like the judge. She simply sat with quiet authority, her presence enough to calm the whispers and settle the air. For the first time in a long while, the courtroom felt balanced, not by power but by respect. Those who had doubted her worth now saw something else. They saw wisdom in her eyes, strength in her silence, and a kind of justice that no uniform or title could give. People who had come to watch a case now found themselves witnessing a moment they would never forget. Adwoa looked across the room, her gaze moving from one face to another. She did not seek revenge, nor did she let pride overtake her. She simply carried herself with the grace of someone who had endured hardship and still stood unbroken. In that chair she was not just a grandmother from the village. She was the voice of dignity itself. And though the judge had only stepped out for a break, the people whispered among themselves, perhaps true justice had already taken its seat. Adwoa sat in the judge's seat, her hands resting lightly on the desk. The silence in the courtroom was deep, as if the walls themselves waited for her voice. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, steady, and without anger. She did not shout. She did not need to. Her voice carried the weight of truth, and that was enough. She began by reminding everyone that the law was not meant to humiliate but to protect. Her words were simple, but they struck the hearts of those listening. "Respect," she said gently, "is the first step to justice. Without respect, the law is only noise." The people leaned forward, listening closely, their eyes fixed on her. Officer Kweku, who had earlier slapped her, sat stiffly in his seat. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense, but when Adwoa's eyes met his, he could not hold her gaze. Slowly his head dropped and he looked down at the floor. In that moment, it was clear that her quiet strength had broken through his pride more than anger ever could. Adwoa spoke of fairness, reminding the court that every person, whether rich or poor, powerful or powerless, stood equal before the truth. Her words flowed gently, yet they carried the sharpness of wisdom. The law, she said softly, belongs to the people, not to those who use it as a weapon. Justice does not live in hands that strike, but in hearts that stand firm. The people in the courtroom sat still, their whispers gone. Even the scribes stopped writing for a while, caught by the weight of her speech. It was as if time had slowed, and the walls of the court held only her words. Some of the older men in the room nodded slowly, as though remembering lessons long forgotten. Women watched with admiration, seeing in Adwoa a mirror of their own strength and endurance. Young people, who had come expecting a simple trial, sat wide-eyed, realizing they were witnessing something far greater than the hearing itself. Adwoa did not point fingers or stir anger. Instead, she built a bridge of truth in the middle of the courtroom. She reminded them that anger and power could silence voices, but only fairness could bring peace. The law must protect the weak, she said firmly, for one day the strong may also fall and need its shield. Her words carried more authority than the gavel that rested before her. The court officials who had first asked her to sit in the judge's seat exchanged looks of quiet respect. They saw now that it was not only a gesture, it was a truth. She belonged there not because of title, but because of the dignity she carried within her. When she finished speaking, the silence that followed was heavier than before, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of respect. No one moved. No one dared to break the moment. It was as if the room itself bowed before her wisdom. For the first time, even Officer Kweku seemed smaller, his pride stripped away. He shifted uneasily, aware that the slap he had given her no longer defined the story. Instead, her calm strength, her refusal to bend, had turned the shame back on him. In that moment, Adwoa was no longer just a grandmother, no longer just a witness. She was the voice of fairness, the image of true justice. The people in the courtroom would remember that day not for the case they had come to watch, but for the words of a woman who had shown them what law should truly mean. And though she had not been chosen as judge, she had spoken like one. When the real judge returned, the courtroom was still heavy with silence. The people had not moved much, and their eyes remained on Adwoa, who sat calmly in the judge's seat. The judge paused at the door, noticing the strange stillness in the room. He had expected noise, disorder, or confusion, but instead, he saw dignity settled over the space like a soft cloak. Adwoa rose slowly, her steps steady, and returned to her place. She did not rush, nor did she show pride. Her face was calm, her eyes strong. The judge asked what had happened, and the officials quietly explained. As the story reached his ears, his expression changed. He turned his gaze toward Adwoa and then toward Officer Kweku. The judge cleared his throat and in a voice deep and clear, he praised Adwoa. He said she had shown more composure, fairness, and wisdom in those few moments than many trained voices of the law. His words carried across the room and people nodded in agreement. For once, no one doubted the judgment. Even the scribes looked up from their papers, their hands still for a moment, to witness the recognition being given. Officer Kweku stood uneasily. His face was tight, his shoulders stiff, but no words came from his mouth. The judge looked at him firmly and declared that his behavior would not go unpunished. A man trusted with power had misused it, and that was a weight the court could not ignore. For striking Adwoa, he would be disciplined, stripped of honor, and reminded that the law does not bow to anger. Gasps filled the room again, but this time they were mixed with murmurs of approval. Many had feared that the officer's rank might shield him, but justice was finally taking its place. For the first time, it seemed the law itself had looked down and spoken with fairness. Adwoa did not smile or gloat. She simply lowered her head, as though the praise belonged not to her but to the truth itself. She left the judge's words hanging in the air, heavy and lasting. People watched her closely, and though she said little, her silence spoke of dignity far louder than any boast could. When the hearing finally ended, Adwoa rose again to leave. Her walk was the same as when she had entered, steady, simple, and calm. But the people no longer looked at her as just a grandmother or just a witness. They saw a woman who had carried strength into the heart of injustice and had not bent. She left not as someone insulted, not as someone broken, but as someone lifted higher by the weight of her own composure. The crowd outside the court whispered her name. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others smiled with quiet pride. Stories began to weave themselves quickly, as stories often do in towns and villages. People repeated what they had seen, each one telling it with awe. A grandmother, they said, sat in the judge's seat. She spoke and the court listened. She turned an insult into honor. Adwoa herself returned to her home, her small house waiting with its silence. She did not seek attention or applause. She poured water into a clay cup, sat down on her wooden stool, and let the day settle in her heart. She had not asked for this, but it had come, and she had met it with courage. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond the walls of the court. Market women spoke of her as they sold their goods, men at the farms repeated her name, and even children acted out the scene in their games. Her quiet dignity had become a tale, a memory for the people to carry forward. Adwoa's life did not change into one of riches or luxury. She was not given gold, nor fine cloth, nor a great title. But what she carried was greater, honor. She became a symbol of strength, proof that wisdom could rise from ordinary lives, and that true power lay not in the hands that struck, but in the hearts that endured. From that day on, whenever people spoke of justice, they remembered her face. And in the town, in the villages around, even in the corners of the city, her name became tied to dignity. Not as a victim, but as a woman who had shown the law itself what it truly meant. She was remembered simply as Adwoa, the grandmother who sat in the judge's seat and turned a moment of insult into a lasting story of honor. The end.